Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of Hashtag Generation, I would like to welcome all of you to another interesting topic of discussion and adding to our series of webinars we have conducted so far under the Media Salon. The topic for today's discussion is, can regulations make social media better? And to discuss on this topic, we have with us three esteemed panelists. Firstly, we have Professor Rohan Samarjeeva, founding chair of Learn Asia, a member of the UN Pulse Advisory Group on the governance of data and artificial intelligence, and a member of the board of advisors of Advocata. Secondly, we have Ms. Mandana Ismail, senior journalist and the editor-in-chief of Sunday Morning. We also have with us Mr. Jagat Vikramanayaka, President's Counsel, who has also worked as an advisor to the Media Law Forum. I warmly welcome all of our panelists for this panel discussion, and I look forward to an hour of fruitful conversation. So if I give a brief introduction to the topic today. On 6th of January this year, President Ranil Wickremesinghe, on a meeting held with newspaper editors and news directors of electronic media, mentioned that he's exploring options to regulate social media in the country through form of legislation. And he also mentioned that this legislation would ideally look something similar to the existing legislation in Singapore, which is the Telecommunication and Social Media Act of Singapore. So on this backdrop, I would like to ask Professor Samarjeeva, what are the existing laws in Singapore at the moment to regulate social media? And what are we as Sri Lanka, in the Sri Lankan law reform in this area, what are we trying to draw from the Singaporean law? And what are the powers the state would get through these laws to regulate social media in the country?
Thank you. I think I'll begin with a sort of overall statement that I do hope that the model that we use in Sri Lanka will not be the Singapore law for a number of reasons. But let me just back up a little. I think it's now beyond doubt that social media, there can be various kinds of harms caused by user-generated content in social media. So one could argue, what is the big deal? Just words, but no, words do matter. People's reputations are harmed. Intellectual property issues can arise. You can have people committing suicide because they're being bullied. There's a whole series of bad things that can happen from user-generated content in social media. Now you could say, well, bullying happened even when I was in school. The world is a nasty place. The issue is that, yes, it's true that bullying and all kinds of defamation, all kinds of bad things can happen in the quotes unquote real world. And there are laws against that. The issue is, and one can act on using those laws, or if you can't, you should go back and fix those general laws. But the real issue here is that the speed and the pervasiveness of the social media platforms makes the effect very, very strong. So everywhere in the world, New Zealand, Australia, Germany, Singapore, they have all acted on this subject. India is, we are planning to, right? So I don't think the old argument that we can do nothing is going to be very effective. So if you look at this list of things that can be done, you can have, even now, I don't think there are, as far as I know, none of the popular platforms allow for completely unfettered communication. They all have some forms of community standards, which if you violate, you will be suspended, you will be deprioritized, you will be warned, you may be thrown off the network altogether, like what happened to President Trump on Twitter and Facebook and so on, right? So that is sort of one kind of response. That is, the company providing the platform does the job. Second is an industry code, which is found in Australia and New Zealand, where the companies come together through some form of consultation, come up with a set of things that are not permissible on the platform, and they appoint some third-party entity to kind of hold each of the member companies accountable. Something on the lines of the kind of newspaper regulation that we have in this country, which many people say is imperfect, but I think can be worked with. Then there is another form called co-regulation. That is, the government says you're compelled to have an industry code. If you don't have the industry code, you'll be in violation of some law. So that means that you can compel the companies, instead of voluntarily joining these codes, they are now compelled to join these codes. But the government still keeps its hands off with regard to formulating and enforcing the code. We could call that a kind of soft form of co-regulation. Co-regulation means it's some private sector entity that does the regulation, but the government is kind of pushing it from behind. Now, the hard co-regulation is where Singapore falls within the scope, right? So within the hard co-regulation, the government will not only say that the companies must do something. The government doesn't mess around with all these industry bodies and industry codes. It says you will act in the public interest. You will not do defamatory things. By the way, the law that we are worried about is called POFMA. POFMA. POFMA means, let me just see what POFMA means. I keep calling it POFMA, so I can't remember what it is. POFMA means Protection from Online Falsehoods and Manipulation Act of 2019, right? So that is the law that you should be looking at. It's available on the web. The regulations are available on the web. You can figure out what the fines are, etc. Now, with POFMA, they give general directions. What you can't put falsehoods, you can't. It has got to be, in the public interest. Most people can't disagree with that. Then under the regulations, which I haven't looked at in the last little while, more details are provided. They have created something called the POFMA office, some entity that has to interface with all the platform providers. Now, what the law does, that it says for people posting content, you can't violate these things. And if you do, it's an offense and we will fine you. But the more important thing is that it also says to the platform providers, you can't do these things. And if we find that you have done these things, we are going to fine you a lot more, 50,000, 500,000 Singapore dollars or something like that, right? Now, even that you could kind of work with, right? Those two provisions. And I would invite all those who are here, you can just search for POFMA, POFMA, and look it up yourself without me having to tell you. Now, I'm going to zero in on the most pernicious, the most problematic part of this and stop. That is a POFMA order, what is called a Part 3 order, asking the individual or the platform to cease and desist, on subject of and place corrections and do various things on pain of fine may be initiated by any minister, right? We're not talking about a committee. We're not talking about the Minister of Justice. We're not talking any of those. Any minister can say, I find that particular communication violating the terms of POFMA, and therefore, please, POFMA office, issue a Part 3 directive and to get those people to take it down, right? Now, Singapore, as we know, is generally a well-run country. You know, their laws are generally enforced in an impartial manner and so on and so forth. But even then, I think this is far too much power to give a minister. Now, if that kind of power were to be given to a minister in a country like ours, I can only imagine that it will turn out very, very badly. Let me stop here, providing opportunity for people to ask questions and for us to respond. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor. Yes, I would move forward with a question to Ms. Mandana Ismail. And drawing from the comments Professor Samarjeeva also brought into the discussion, I would like to ask Ms. Ismail, as a journalist, how do you see the need for regulation, specifically hardcore state regulation on media as a whole and specifically on social media? How do you see it?
Okay, thank you, Namya, for the opportunity, first of all. Well, as a journalist, it is quite an interesting place that we are in today because social media, I mean, digital media platforms continue to evolve, and it has become part, I mean, it's basically part of life. You cannot take life out of it. So when it comes to digital media and including mainstream media, now it is about more of a cohabitation. It's like we cannot live without the other. So when it comes to state regulations, the constant issue that we have had in the mainstream media is the interpretations that are given to the laws. We all know now, let's say, for example, the ICCPR Act. I mean, that was one of the laws. It's seen as a progressive law in most countries that actually was brought to defend the human rights defenders and all that. But in Sri Lanka's case, the misinterpretations have made it quite the opposite. So when it comes to state regulations, and as Professor Rohan Samarjeeva rightfully pointed out, when it comes to like vesting that power with a minister, an individual, and in the context of Sri Lanka, it could be very, very dangerous. And in Sri Lanka, we are still managing with a whole load of archaic laws. If you look at Sri Lanka's media landscape, even the legacy media, it is only print media that has any form of regulation. The print media has a Sri Lanka Press Council, and there are some form of like, you know, that there's some way of regulation. But let's take, for example, electronic media. Now, electronic media still does not have any form of regulations in Sri Lanka. The country's electronic media is more or less governed by the Sri Lanka Rupawahini Corporation Act and the Sri Lanka Broadcasting Corporation Act. But as we can see, those legislations were adopted decades ago. Now there's much that has happened, and into that fold now has come digital media, which is an ever expanding and fast evolving space. So how do we manage that? And of course, I would say there is a need for some form of regulation, but whether it is state regulation, I don't think I would agree on that. Whether it is some form of co-regulation, I mean, some form of regulation where maybe where the civil society together with the digital media, the tech companies, the digital media platforms, all get together. If there's a collaborative movement towards some form of regulation, I think that would be more appropriate in Sri Lanka's context, mostly, given the fact that countries like, I mean, the EU has a similar code for the digital media, although they have faced quite a lot of challenges in implementing them. Australia, and then the latest last year was New Zealand. So far, New Zealand model seems to be something that seems to be working, and something that like there's a lot of interest in that. And even in Sri Lanka, there is currently a movement of formulating an industry-based code of practice for digital media companies to use in Sri Lanka. That is being initiated by Factum together with Asia Internet Coalition of Singapore, which is called AIC. So AIC has all these big tech companies, the digital media platforms in its partnership. So together with them, there has been a code that has been drafted. And so far there are deliberations between AIC and the local core group. And there have been public consultations and stakeholder consultations as well. So that is a move in the positive direction in order to prevent any form of state control coming in. So because you referred to the comments made by President Wickremesinghe on the 6th of January with a group of editors. On the same day, myself and another group of editors also met with the president. And during that discussions, to a question posed by me, his response was that Sri Lanka is in the process of formulating a tech policy for the first time. So if we are looking at formulating a tech policy, and if we are looking at attracting all these big tech companies to look at Sri Lanka as an alternative out of Singapore, because a lot of these digital tech companies are also looking at other alternatives in the region, because they were initially, some of them were based in Hong Kong. Then following issues with China, they shifted to Singapore. Now they are also looking at moving to other locations. So, I mean, there has been some interest in Sri Lanka, provided that there is a conducive environment for them to consider Sri Lanka even an alternative. So if we are looking at that area, and it seems the president is interested in that area, then we will have to look at some form of co-regulations. I think that would be the best way forward, because otherwise we do need that. Because if you look at all these digital media platforms, you see some habitual violators also. So these habitual violations are things that are causing a lot of issues, which is why the code that is currently being drafted in consultation with AIC by Factum, there are 5 areas that are being focused on. It's disinformation, misinformation, hate speech, inciting violence, and online harassment and bullying. So these are the 5 key areas that are being focused on, because these seem to be the areas that kind of result in all the other issues related to digital media. So from a journalist perspective, I would say that we have to create a safe platform for everyone, the user as well as, the person who, I mean, anybody even sharing the content should feel safe, that to know that this digital space is a safe space for me to share whatever I need to, or even to communicate or anything like that. And given the fact that there are certain constraints in legacy media, print and broadcast, so digital media is the evolving platform that is going to be the future, more or less. That does not mean that there would not be any legacy media as well, because people still tend to look at print media and electronic media for more confirmation on stories. So I would feel that while there needs to be some form of regulation to make sure that there are some checks and balances, especially with regard to habitual violators of media ethics, there also needs to be some form of co-regulation that needs to be looked at. And I would be very hesitant to consider state regulation at this point.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mandana, for that comment. I would now move on to President's Counsel, Mr. Jagath Wickramanayake. Sir, so far from this discussion, what we have gathered is that there is one particular great danger in adopting the Singaporean law as it is, because it gives a lot of power to the ministers, And in Sri Lankan context, that would be very problematic. And also, according to Ms. Mandana, hard state regulation would not only discourage the users of social media, but also the tech companies, which will also be an issue. So in this backdrop, so what do you, how do you think this impacts the freedom of expression of the citizens, which is a fundamental right? And also, how do you think the legislation works in terms of regulating social media platforms per se, not only the expression of people, but also regulating social media platforms?
Thank you, Namya, for having me here. The first thing that you need to look at before we talk about the regulatory framework for social media, we must look at whether the state mechanism in relation to any kind of a regulatory framework in this country is working in the right way, right? Because we are talking about now, if you see what Professor Samarajiva and also Mandana stated, we are talking about three kinds of regulations. Either it has to be the hardcore, the state regulatory framework, or the co-regulation and the self-regulation. So when it comes to media, we are in an era where the free speech at its peak now. Like those days or a couple of years ago, if you want to express yourself, we say through a legacy media, through broadcast or rather print media, you need to go behind somebody, you need to get the opportunity, you might have to please someone to get that opportunity. So most of the people, the majority did not have the opportunity of expressing themselves the way that they want to express. And also, we were relying completely on a few media organizations to receive news, or rather receive any information, either from the state or from any other source. So now the situation has completely changed, where people have so much of information available in the space, and anybody who wants to receive any information, who wants to do any research work, who wants to go beyond, whatever the work that he does, or, like you have enough and more information available. And also there are enough and more platforms where you can express yourself, where you can come out and state whatever that you need to state. So all these freedom are being exercised by people in this country already, and for many years now. So when it comes to regulatory framework, the issue is you need to see as to how we are going to practically do it. Now, as a professor very correctly stated, in a country like Singapore, probably they will not be misusing the power that is given to the ministers. But if you see what is happening here, even with the legacy media, the issue that we are faced with at present is the political manipulation. As Mandana said, even the ICCPR Act, which is meant for the protection of people of the country, is being used to harass people. We have seen that in the past. So when you bring in legislation to control or rather regulate social media, how we are going to practically do it is going to be a major issue. Now, whether you're going to regulate the user, or whether you're going to regulate the platform, so what really you want to regulate, or how we are going to practically do it. So that's going to be a problem. And also, when you look at those major players in the world in social media like YouTube or Facebook or anything like that, merely because you have a kind of state regulation in the country, probably they will listen to, or they will bow down to regulations in certain countries, looking at the stake that they have in the society, the money that they make out of the platform in those countries. But when it comes to a country like Sri Lanka, probably the market is negligible for them. So whether they would, I think the same thing happened in relation to regulations brought in by the Pakistani government some time ago. So though the big players were willing to accept the regulations imposed on them by countries like Germany, they were not willing to accept the regulations imposed by countries like Pakistan. So we really do not know, even if we bring in certain regulations as to, like on the basis that, like we think that we're going to bring in regulations, asking them to bring down certain things, whether these social media platforms will agree to that. They probably will agree, or they will prefer to withdraw it completely from a country like us rather than adhering to the regulation. So we need to look at all these things before we adopt a regulatory framework that is there, which may be working in a developed country if you want to introduce something like that here. So in answering the question that you posed to me, I personally think the state regulatory framework, if it is not going to be co-regulation or self-regulation, if it is going to be hardcore state control regulation, I personally think it's going to be a major issue. It will create huge problems in relation to freedom of expression as well as the free speech. It's already, as I stated earlier, already we see the media, the legacy media is being controlled by certain people, by certain segments of the society for the political manipulation. Even the print media, with certain print media, the same thing is happening. So if this is what is expected by the government in bringing in regulations, I think it's going to be a huge blow on the free speech and the freedom of expression. So people's right, the people's opportunity to express themselves and to if they really want to state something against the corruption, against the state mechanism, so those opportunities might be lost. And I personally think when in an era, when the country is most needed, the laws that are in Singapore in relation to corruption is not brought in. But before that, we try to bring in regulations in relation to social media, maybe with some ulterior motive to control or rather suppress the dissent. So the political manipulation, if we don't have a system to stop political manipulation, the using the laws that we have already in the country for purposes other than the purpose it was brought in or it was introduced to the country. So without stopping all these things, bringing in state control regulations, I personally think it's going to be a huge blow on the freedom of expression of the country.
Thank you, Mr. Jagat Vikramnayake, for that comment. So I would, drawing from that, what Mr. Vikramnayake said, I would actually like to turn back to Professor Rohan Samarajiva. Professor, so according to what Mr. Jagat Vikramnayake mentioned, we all know that with social media, it's not like the mainstream media, which was there decades back. Now, not only that the expression of a person is fast and on the can do at the spur of the moment, the feedback also is similarly fast and reactive, and so that you can get people's opinion or people's opinion on your expression sooner than what it was in mainstream media. So in this backdrop, do you think regulating social media with hardcore legislation would be perceived by the general public as a way of curtailing public dissent?
Well, I can tell you that in terms of the general public, one could argue that there's nothing called the general public, right? What you have are individuals from among the general public who will express this or that opinion, make this or that demand. So there will always be people who will raise questions about government or platform inaction on child pornography, pornography in general, violence, bullying, various things like that. So they will be complaining not about freedom of expression. They will be complaining about the fact that no action is being taken about what they consider to be bad things. Now, we can all agree that child pornography is a bad thing and so on. And the agreement levels will keep dropping as we go down that list, right? I think most people will agree on child pornography, but then we'll have more people dropping off from the consensus. So there is one side. That's also the general public speaking, right? Then there will be those who feel that their rights of free expression are being affected by government legislation. I just want to make a small correction to what Mr. Jagat Gunawardena, I think, said. I don't think that the Singapore law or anything that is being contemplated, I mean, the Singapore law has some parts of direct regulation. That is, a government entity serves a notice on a person who has posted information and says, remove it, or apologize, or do whatever, do correction, etc. A Part 3 order. But when it acts against a platform, it's not direct regulation, it's co-regulation. It's telling the platform, you have to keep bad stuff away from the people who watch, who participate in social media platforms in Singapore. Otherwise, we are going to put hefty fines on you, right? So that's actually co-regulation. That is, they're asking the platform to regulate, and the government is kind of backing it up with some force. And I would also make a distinction between self-regulation and what these companies, it's not actually self-regulation. People call it self-regulation, but it's actually regulation by private entity, regulation by a private firm. So that is already happening, right? That is already going on. Whether the government acts or not, there is regulation of social media, user-generated content in this country, right? People are being subject to various kinds of sanctions by the platforms, and they are also now they're engaging in self-regulation. That is, they are modifying their behavior in order not to get suspended, in order to prevent any kind of sanction being imposed on them by the platform provider. So regulation is happening anyway, right? Self-regulation is happening, private regulation is happening. Now we are only talking about the government coming in, state regulation coming in the form of hard co-regulation and direct regulation. Now, direct regulation is also happening. Now, there was one fellow today who got arrested because he had put a social media post saying he's going to put people who come to the independence celebrations in the Bay Area. That's a form of regulation. He said something, he's being arrested for saying it, right? But that is not under these new laws, it's under some old provision in the penal code. I have to figure out what that is, but it's under the old penal code. So what we now have is a situation where there will be demands from different segments of society for more regulation, for more regulation by the platforms, by more regulation by the government, etc. And there'll be other people who say, no, don't have the state get involved in this. I'm in that group, right? I would rather the state doesn't get involved. But then the question is, should we allow the freedom? I think then we have to collectively face the question and address the problem of private regulation without appeal, without due process, and so on. So that is something I think we should work on. I think the initiative that Mandana talked about, which is to get an industry code, is very opportune at this time. Let's get the industry code in place so that then we can tell the president that we have some mechanism in place. Let's observe how it works. Let's see what its weaknesses and strengths are. And based on that, the democratically elected representatives, our lawmakers, can take some decisions. But we as the public, as informed members of the public, would like to have a say in how that legislation comes about.
Thank you very much, Professor. If I turn to Ms. Mandana, also as Professor mentioned about the industry code that is being formulated. So you mentioned previously that there are 5 aspects that the industry code looks at. So if there is an opportunity to use those aspects in the state regulation, how do you think that how do you think that can be that these aspects of misinformation, disinformation, harmful hate speech, the aspects that you mentioned previously, can be drawn from to include those things into state regulation in a more favorable manner that would protect freedom of expression and also the interest of the social media platforms?
Yes, so the industry code, as I said, is currently going through discussions, and then it will be put out for public views as well before it is launched. And the thing is, since it is a form of co-regulation and where the state can also, because now the whole drafting process has 2 layers: the core group that is involved in the drafting of the code of practice in collaboration with the AIC of Singapore. And then there is an advisory panel as well. Now the advisory group also has representations from the government as well, so that they also will be part of the whole process. Like the draft will be shared with them, then the industry concerns and the amendments to the draft will also be shared with them, so that they will also see what the industry expects, as well as the concerns of the core group that drafted it, as well as the state side as well. So there is representation from the President's office in that advisory panel as well. And so there is a form of discussion that is going on. So we are hopeful that this industry based, like the co-regulation, that process that is ongoing, would actually be looked at favorably by the government. And maybe, like, I mean, although there has been many discussions and, like, news reports saying that there are moves to regulate social media and so on, there have been times, like, I mean, after the news stories, when we have, as journalists, when we have contacted the authorities, they have said, oh, it's still in discussion stage. So even the latest, whenever there's an issue, whenever there's some where the government is under pressure or some politician is under pressure, there is always talk of these regulations coming in and the need for them and so on. So although there are discussions, we are hopeful that the state would also wait to see what this industry-led regulations would be. As Professor Samarajiva said, until that happens, there is regulations in any way, like that self-regulation, as well as the digital media platforms have their own set of regulations also, their community standards and all that. So this is going beyond that to ensure that there is some form of accountability on the part of the digital media platforms as well, when it comes to content shared on platforms where Sri Lanka is concerned. So the thing is, the government, if they are going to go ahead with the state regulations, chances are, most of the times when governments have proceeded with such regulations, now case in point is Singapore, the tech companies have had issues with them. But since Singapore is a different market and the contribution is far higher, there have been some form of, let's say, discussion and tolerance, whether the tech companies, the digital media platforms will have a similar approach when it comes to Sri Lanka, which is a much smaller market. And all that is another aspect that needs to be considered. So Sri Lanka already has some issues, like, there have been several times when social media was blocked during certain incidents during the past few years. So Sri Lanka already has that issue to deal with. So unless we move forward as a country that is ready to engage with the world, and to say that, like, we do have a tech policy, as the president said, that is apparently in the process of being drafted, coming up with that tech policy. And if we come up with some form of co-regulation that is more of a dialogue along with the dialogue with the industry, I mean, I feel that there might not be a necessity for the state to kind of intervene. And the whole issue of freedom of expression being under threat, as well as the concerns that would come up from the industry players as well, could be avoided in such a scenario.
Yes, thank you for that, Ms. Mandana. I saw a hand raising. I would like to inform our viewers that after this final question to Mr. Jagat Wickramanayake, we can open for a session of Q&A, like a very brief Q&A session. So I would take that question after this question, which I am to pose to Mr. Jagat Wickramanayake. Sir, so we previously also discussed about how this, if there would be a hardcore regulation, how it would affect freedom of expression of people. But also we know that freedom of expression is not an absolute right. And it has already been, there are restrictions imposed by the Constitution itself. And if we take instances such as the Digana incident, which happened, which social media actually had a part to play in, and which Facebook publicly apologized for, also for not doing their part during that period. How do you see, do you think that co-regulation or self-regulation or any form of other regulation apart from hardcore regulation could actually regulate social media enough that it would be a safe space for everyone to express themselves?
Yeah, that's what I said, Namia, even before. What is the mechanism that you are trying to introduce in the form of regulations to regulate everything, or regulate rather all these online, the social media platforms, as to how we are practically going to do that? So that's going to be a kind of an issue, even if you introduce whatever the regulation. So I think I'm fully in agreement with Professor Samarjiva and also Mandana. I think I heard that Factum is doing some, in the process of introducing some kind of self-regulations. So that is a very good thing, because what I feel is, if you introduce, or if you agree, and if you get together and introduce a kind of a self-regulatory system or co-regulations, the government absolutely need not step in and try to regulate the social media at all. So because if that mechanism is going to work properly, you don't need that. So coming back to the question that you asked, now we have if you look at the freedom of expression, it is there in the Constitution. It's guaranteed by the Constitution by way of a fundamental right. And also the limitations are set out in the Constitution itself. So the issue here is, in the process of introducing a hardcore regulation, whether the freedom of expression of the people will be hampered. So what I would say is, more than the freedom of expression. Now see, freedom of expression is on one side, but if the social media is not going to be safe at all, without any regulation at all, it probably be not very safe for people to use. So that is why I'm saying I'm not against the regulations. I'm actually for regulation. But of course, what we all, I think we all in agreement, what we are against at the moment is the government without having any kind, without allowing or without encouraging the players in the social media to regulate themselves by introducing self-regulations, or as Professor Samarjeeva very correctly said, by way of co-regulation, they are straight away trying to bring in a system where they can regulate the social media through the government mechanism. We have seen in the past that did not work in relation to other things. We are talking about independent commissions of this country, but we have a doubt to what extent they are independent. Even the appointment now, I'm privy to certain information. Some time ago, online manipulation and falsehood act was actually, a bill was drafted. And I think, you know, the people who got together in executing that, or rather drafting that, they were, you know, to some extent, they were very liberal. So they were looking at all these aspects. But unfortunately, that particular bill was expecting to establish a commission to look into the matter. But now why it is not moving forward is, apparently the police is asking for the powers of bringing down, you know, ordering the media platforms to bring down, you know, what they have shared, what they have posted, that power to be given to them instead of an independent commission that they seek to establish by this particular law. So if at this moment, giving it to another authority, where the government is going to have some kind of a control of, and the police is looking forward, or police is waiting to take that power to themselves, so we can certainly see that this regulation story is going way beyond what you and I can expect. So I personally think we need regulation, there's no question, but that regulatory framework will have to be, you know, mostly I would say it has to be a self-regulation system, or rather, if it is not going to work, probably co-regulation, and that will create a safe environment for anyone to play in the space or the internet.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vikramanayaka. Yes, so I think the conversation we are at now is that all our panelists are actually in agreement that social media requires some form of regulation. But whether it's co-regulation, an industrial code, or whether hardcore regulation is suitable is where we are at. So I would like to give this opportunity to our viewers for a very brief Q&A session. We can take about like very few questions. So if there are any questions, you all are free to type the questions in the chat, or even raise your hand, and I can give you the opportunity to ask the question directly from our panelists. If there are no questions, I would like to give the opportunity to our panelists to give final remarks on this topic. So I would like to start with Ms. Mandana Ismail this time. Ms. As a final remark, do you like to add anything to this conversation?
Yes, Namya. Well, as a final remark, what I would like to say is that we need to understand that digital media, platforms, digital media and its evolution and all that, it's here to stay. So we have to find ways of working with what we have until we sort out some form of co-regulation that we've been talking about. Because at the end of the day, we do have to understand that despite the self-regulation as well as the community standards and other regulations that have been put in place by respective digital media platforms, there continue to be certain harmful content that is being posted and shared. So because of that, I think we all need to kind of work hard on getting some form of co-regulation in place before the state intervenes and presents some form of legislation that might result in that might complicate matters and result in many misinterpretations as well as other forms of curtailment of freedom of expression. So the main thing is that there has to be some form of regulation, and that I would reiterate. And of course, and definitely it should not be something that the state would take the upper hand. And until then, I suppose the existing law, within the existing framework, we should be able to manage. And maybe there needs to be more awareness among people on the proper use of digital media platforms, because Sri Lanka's digital literacy levels are quite low. Although the mobile penetration level is high, when it comes to digital literacy, there seems to be a huge disparity. So until and unless that is also addressed, I think we will have to be very mindful in how we use this digital media space, and also keep in mind that the digital media space could also have some form of influence on legacy media as well. So as a member of the legacy media, since I represent print media, it has not been easy on us as well, because it's a tough call sometimes trying to compete with a media platform that keeps updating and breaking news on almost every second. But still, you have to kind of focus on the ethical aspect, because at the end of the day, we are all talking about human bonds, human communication, and human relationships. So therefore, keeping that in mind, I would once again reiterate that we need to move forward with some form of co-regulation to ensure that there's some action being taken on whatever the harmful content that continues to be seen on digital media platforms, as well as some form of action against habitual violators. And on that note, I think I have said what I have to say about that. Thank you, Namya, for the opportunity.
Thank you, Ms. Ismail. I would like to turn to Mr. Jagat Vikramanayake. Sir, do you have any final remarks to add to this discussion?
I'm not going to take much time, Namya.
Sorry, we have a few minutes, right?
Okay, taking it forward from what Mandana said, a completely unregulated industry with so much of freedom and liberty is not going to do much good to the society. So we need to have some kind of a discipline, some kind of a regulatory framework. But on the other hand, if the government is going to regulate, if the government is going to take control of this entire regulatory mechanism, it's definitely not going to be an independent, kind of a regulatory system where the people can make use of the opportunity and use the free speech to express themselves. We might lose all that. So what is best for the moment, as we have discussed in this forum today, to support for I think it's best to have a kind of a co-regulatory system where there will be some kind of a discipline. The political manipulation should be able to avoid it, and also the people will not be scared of internet, because now what has happened is even good people whom we should have in the politics, in politics or things like that, they're not coming forward because they don't want to face any kind of issues with social media. So we need to have a proper regulatory system without allowing the regulatory system to take control of the media and the social media by the state. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Professor, do you have anything to add to the discussion?
Yeah, I think I'd like to bring up two what I consider fundamental issues. One is what is acceptable and what is not. In the end, all this, we are talking about content regulation. And even my fellow panelists are saying there are certain kinds of content that are unacceptable. So it really boils down to that question, which is, what is unacceptable content, right? What is unacceptable speech? When I used to teach this subject in the old days, we used to say, you have the freedom of speech, but you can't cry fire in a crowded theater, right? your freedom of speech extends right up to my nose, but you can't take off my nose, that kind of stuff. But that's not really it's not that simple, right? So I, for one, just to give an example, I, for one, thought that this Dhammika Paniya and various concoctions that the government people were flogging in the early days of the pandemic were actually harmful. That is my view. I believe in modern science, right? So does it mean that what I consider harmful, things like Dhammika Paniya, should have been completely prohibited from social media platforms? That's really what the question is, because the minute you start asking specific questions of this nature, you find that you will not have society-wide or even panel-wide agreement, right? Because a lot of us think, as long as what I consider acceptable is allowed, so everything else should be regulated. So this is the real challenge, right? So if you don't go to the Singapore model, where a minister can say that a certain kind of content is harmful, should be removed, etc., we have to answer the question, who is going to make the determination, right? Is it going to be an independent body? Now, we think, particularly lawyers, I think, place great value on independent commissions. But you can see that, independent commissions, you have to also ask about accountability. On what basis does the chairman of the Public Utilities Commission is he actually basing himself on the law, on the powers that have been given to him by the law, or is he exceeding them? If he exceeds them, is that okay just because it's an independent commission, right? So we have to ask these hard questions. And we have in our legal system, and in all legal systems, in fact, a basic fundamental principle about due process, as we used to call it in the United States, or in the British system, we call it natural justice. Let both sides be heard. Let the decision be made by an unbiased judge based on the facts placed before him or her, right? So we should see, because in a number of these cases, we are violating that principle of letting both sides be heard, right? Today, Facebook will ban people, will throw them off the network without giving them an adequate opportunity to present their side of the case. That is already happening. That is happening right now, right? So I think we need to pay attention to some of these things and at least argue for some form of appeal mechanism, some ombudsman function for people who are taking decisions that affect those who are using the social media platforms to communicate. I agree that these are private platforms. I agree that, I'm not paying for my use of the Facebook. It's being funded by somebody else. Enormous amounts of money, data storage, content moderators, all kinds of people's salaries are being paid, and I don't pay anything, right? So one could ask, well, what right do you have to pontificate? But it seems to me that if it is so important to society, we should have some appeals, safeguards, that kind of thing in place. I think if we can think about those two basic points, that what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, what is truth, what is untruth. These are not easy questions. And then whenever we are taking decisions on those kinds of sensitive, important, socially critical matters, what kind of procedures are we using? I think those are the two thoughts I'd like to leave with you.
Thank you very much, Professor. So if I summarize, this discussion has brought into light several important factors. So we have discussed whether or not regulation is needed, and if so, what form of regulation would best suit Sri Lanka in the current context specifically. And also, if we are regulating the content on social media, the need for such specific guidelines so that these decisions would not be ad hoc decisions to remove content. And also our speakers has brought into this discussion the impact of hard regulation on the freedom of expression, as well as the impact of those regulations on social media companies. So I think we have discussed on all these aspects in this 1 hour, and I would like to thank our esteemed panelists, Professor Samarujiva, President's Council, Mr. Jagat Vikramanayaka, and Ms. Mandana Ismail for joining us today for this interesting discussion. And I would also like to apologize on behalf of #Generation for the interruption that occurred during your speeches. And I would like to thank everyone joining us today. Have a nice day.
Thank you, Damya.
Thank you.